HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Slayers and Vampires, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized oral history of Buffy and Angel, by Edward Gross and Mark A. Altman, read by James Patrick Cronin and Julie McKay. Once more, with kneeling. She's cool, she's hot, she's tepid, she's all-temperature Buffy, by Mark A. Altman. Make no mistake, Joss Whedon is a god. Not a Zeus-like god who hurls thunderbolts from the sky and demands sacrifices of goats, chickens, geese, and the occasional Vestal virgin, but an honest-to-goodness writing deity, a wizard of words, a maestro of the macabre and liege of letters. Not to mention he's far more partial to plaid button-downs than togas. But, not unlike Vargas on the receiving end of a spear gun from 007, you get the point. Or Mr. Pointy, in his case. If that fact got lost on us during his less than halcyon days, when Whedon wrote for the mouthy Roseanne and Dan, resurrected Alien, or even when he debuted the first Buffy, who failed to slay audiences on movie screens in 1992, by now it should be abundantly clear to those of us fortunate enough to have been hip to the oeuvre of Joss Whedon, this is a man of boundless creativity, thoughtfulness, passion, intelligence, and wit. Are you not entertained? In a medium and a genre in which sexy blonde girls were cannon fodder for the creepy crawlies that go bump and slash in the night, Whedon flipped the script. Instead of being the prey, the lithe little blonde girl with the silly name was the predator, keeping the troubled town of Sunnydale safe from all manner of nefarious and apocalyptic threats to her friends and family, from points north, west, south, and east. It's been said before, but it's worth reiterating that Buffy didn't take place in the high school world of a John Hughes comedy. It used its supernatural trappings as a metaphor for the challenges and pain of adolescence. Not many of us could relate to growing up in a small town terrorized by soulless vampires, goblins, and ghouls, but most can relate to stories of unrequited love or lust, sexy and soulful mysterious strangers, insular high school cliques, and cheerleaders whose bodies are possessed by their obsessed mothers. Okay, not so much that last one. High school drama had come a long way since Glenn Ford in the Blackboard Jungle. And what makes Buffy so unique is that it stands as perhaps one of the last vestiges of a more innocent age of adolescence, before social media and iPhones. When Buffy was created, it was still the era of creaking plot mechanics that could hinge on a missed ring on the landline phone, and in which the only social network in a town like Sunnydale was hanging out at a place like the Bronze, while listening to music from a procession of great to middling 90s bands. Buffy was delivering its swan song to the more innocent days of high school just as the first glimmers of social networking were arriving on the scene with Friendster. Remember that short-lived precursor to MySpace and Facebook? Buffy would be a very different show today. The denizens of Sunnydale would be Snapchatting and tweeting about mayors transforming into giant lizard gods and hellish Halloween celebrations. For God's sakes, stay away from Ethan's and lay off the band candy. Is that more than 140 characters? Meanwhile, Whedon's spin-off of Buffy, Angel, is a miraculous story of survival against all odds. The series debuted with David Boreanaz's titular vampire as Philip Marlowe, Light, attempting to redeem himself on the mean streets of the City of Angels in a ham-fisted, noir-tinged detective drama. Sputtering for nearly half a season, the show began to find its own distinct identity, miraculously and brilliantly reinventing itself several times. First, when Cordelia was bequeathed the visions of the late Glenn Quinn's Doyle, and then when Angel investigations took up residence in an abandoned Art Deco hotel, and finally, when Angel and company would find themselves in charge of the evil law firm Wolfram and Hart. What was stunning was that despite the seemingly inane, high-concept TV guide description, Angel, the vampire with a soul, is forced to run an evil law firm in Los Angeles, redundant to be sure, the show's dramatic reinvention for its fifth season was a home run, and, Much like Next Generation's darker, more brooding spin-off Deep Space Nine, Angel often outshone its progenitor, despite having a smaller audience and receiving far less critical acclaim. Embracing a more serialized structure than its progenitor, Angel required a more serious commitment from viewers of the pre-DVR age, who would be amply awarded for their loyalty. Although I vaguely recall purchasing my first TiVo around that time, and I still have my plush Mr. TiVo to prove it. As Buffy began sputtering to its inevitable conclusion, Angel continued to evolve, culminating in one of the great series finales of all time, a supernatural Godfather denouement, a cliffhanger that is, regrettably, unlikely ever to be resolved. Not since Mike Torello and Ray Luca grappled violently in the cockpit of a rapidly descending Cessna in the second season capper of Crime Story had a series left you hungering for more as the axe swung. And since the respective conclusions of Buffy and Angel, Whedon has continued to amass quite the filmography, a subject for another book, surely. He rarely repeats himself, and no matter how disparate the material, marks his work with a singular style and wit. Even without Joss Whedon's name in the opening credits, it'd be hard to miss his unique imprimatur on such a diverse array of film and television as 2002's Firefly, the addictive, short-lived cult sci-fi western about a ragtag group of underdogs and misfits long before Guardians of the Galaxy made such things in vogue, and 2012's The Avengers, featuring a distinctly different band of underdogs and misfits who saved the world and transformed Whedon from a revered cult figure to a bankable blockbuster film director, all while he knocked out the micro-budget adaptation of Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, a charming and delightful retelling of the Bard's whimsical comedy, which gets a very Whedon-esque makeover and was shot in his backyard. He made the film on a shoestring between Hammer Time and Hulk busting. Doesn't this man sleep? Apparently not. Meanwhile, there was the far less successful Eliza Dushku vehicle for Fox, Dollhouse, the genre-subverting The Cabin in the Woods, directed by Buffy veteran and future Martian Oscar nominee Drew Goddard, which Whedon and Goddard cooked up in a matter of days, and that harkens back to horror classics like Sam Raimi's Evil Dead, but has a distinctly Whedon-esque spin, and the beloved Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog, with the always delightful Nathan Fillion as the preening, narcissistic superhero Captain Hammer, a dastardly and love-struck Neil Patrick Harris as Dr. Horrible, and an adorable Felicia Day. And I would know, since I've been lucky enough to work with both of them, the awesome and avuncular Nathan on Castle and Felicia on The Librarians, where we played hours of Lord of the Rings pinball with Sean Astin. But that's a story for another time. As a television writer myself, it's hard not to appreciate Whedon's sheer talent and prodigious output, which I've always enjoyed, respected, and admired. My personal connection to Whedon predates this book by over 2 decades. When I first moved to Los Angeles and was working as a journalist for Sci-Fi Universe, the self-proclaimed magazine for science fiction fans with a life that I had started for Larry Flint, of all people, I attended a Writers Guild mixer, where I first encountered Joss. In his ubiquitous and unmistakable uniform of t-shirt, jeans, and button-down plaid shirt. We talked for a while about his new film, Toy Story. He was excited and equally trepidatious about the film's imminent release, Pixar's first. He'd already become one of Hollywood's most accomplished go-to guys for script fixes, doing substantial uncredited rewrites for films ranging from 1994's Speed to 1995's infamous Waterworld, which contributed a new twist to the seemingly immutable Hollywood axiom: never work with kids or animals, and definitely never, ever shoot on water. We all know now, of course, that the first Toy Story is a triumph, one of the great animated films of all time, and became a perennial favorite for a generation of children and adults. But I'll never forget walking out of the Crest Theater in Westwood during the opening weekend to find Joss ensconced in the shadows of the back row quietly watching the film, and the audience. Surprised, I approached him and asked what he was doing watching his own film, which he had assuredly seen many times already. Chagrined and embarrassed, a nervous Whedon smiled, answering he didn't want anyone to recognize him, hoping to anonymously see if the film played with a real paying audience. Indeed it did. It was nothing short of a masterpiece. That was the last time I ever saw that side of Joss. Success didn't make him an egotist or an asshole, as it does for many in our business, but it did make him deservedly self-confident, and a better dresser. After that, I would regularly run into him on Tuesdays at the late Pico Boulevard haunt, Laser Blazer, where we both used to pick up the latest Laserdiscs and later DVDs and Blu-rays. We would have brief and amiable conversations, but I can't say I ever got to really know him very well, although we were bonded into that community of pre-Amazon obsessives who would march out to the store every Tuesday to pick up the latest new releases on the day they came out, often leaving them in the original shrink wrap for years. As anyone who is still part of the dying breed of connoisseurs of physical media will adamantly and lovingly tell you, sometimes it's just enough to know they're there. Perhaps my most embarrassing run-in with Joss was years later at the Saturn Awards, the awesomely kitsch, sweet, nostalgic, and charming award show devoted to genre entertainment held annually by the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. For years, my wife had been consumed by a question that she desperately wanted answered. Now, you have to understand that my wonderful spouse, Naomi, is a die-hard fan of the Whedonverse, and a devoted fan of Buffy and Angel. Not only did we have a string quartet play the beautiful sacrifice theme from The Gift at our wedding and name two of our rescue cats, Giles and Willow, but for her first Mother's Day, I took her to Torrance to see Sunnydale High School, aka Torrance High School, and the original Summers residence nearby. In fact, when she first moved to Los Angeles, Buffy was a great solace to her since she had left behind so many of her close friends in Chicago, and it was the gang at Sunnydale High that helped her acclimate to her new life in a new city with new friends, not unlike the Slayer herself. So you see, even though I ducked having to ask her a question for several years, unfortunately, when she heard that Joss was going to be at the Saturns, there was no way I was extricating myself from this unwelcome task. Naomi insisted that I talk to Joss and get a definitive answer to her vexing query. What did she want to know, you may ask? Not far from where we live in Beverly Hills, there was a three-way intersection. At it stood the Willow School, Wesley Street, and nestled between them and now long gone, the imposing Angelus Shoe Factory. Naomi thought perhaps this had been an inspiration to Joss when he was creating Buffy. I, of course, thought I'd never eat lunch, dinner, or brunch in this town again if I posed her question. But when your wife asks you to do something, other than take out the garbage, you do it, and so I did. Mortified, I approached Joss at the after-party, and after exchanging familiar pleasantries and downing a few vodka-enhanced beverages, I finally, reluctantly, asked him if indeed this had been an inspiration for Buffy. Smiling amusedly but taking pity on me by not outright laughing, he answered, quietly and thoughtfully, "You can tell your wife, definitely not." And so ended one of the all-time great, long-held mysteries of Buffy for our family. Hopefully, however, in this volume you are now listening to, Ed Gross and I will be able to clarify many other mysteries, dispel some apocryphal myths, hip you to the best craft services, and reintroduce you to the wonderful worlds of Buffy and Angel in a new, candid, and exciting way. The joy of writing these oral histories of such beloved pop culture staples is not only to revisit worlds we love, like Star Trek in the 50-year mission, and Sunnydale and Angel's City of Angels in this volume, and share insider stories with passionate fans about the creation and making of these iconic series, but also to showcase the behind-the-scenes tales and many of the unheralded talents of so many of these wonderful shows with those who may have never encountered them before. At 20 years old, there's an entire generation of TV viewers who didn't grow up with Buffy, Willow, Xander, Cordelia, Faith, Angel, Spike, Giles, Willow, Dawn, Flutie, Snyder, Anya, Kendra, Gentleman, Masters, and Mayers. Once they listen to this volume, it's our hope they will feel as if they did. Buffy and Angel are distinctly products of their time. They were created early in the second golden age of television, after the emergence of series like Hill Street Blues and St. Elsewhere changed the medium indelibly forever, but before the renaissance of The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, and Breaking Bad. But for as long as girls love boys, kids endure the endless tortures of high school, and we question the myriad sounds that go bump in the night, Buffy and Angel will remain timeless. The visual effects of Mayor Wilkins turning into a giant snake notwithstanding, of course. That does look pretty lame now. October 29th, 2016. Vampires and Slayers, oh my. I may be love's bitch, but at least I'm man enough to admit it. By Edward Gross. Growing up in the 1960s, I had a number of pop culture obsessions, most of which are still with me, including Superman, James Bond, Star Trek, Planet of the Apes, The Odd Couple — I saw the movie when I was 8 and have loved the concept ever since — and vampires. As to the latter, I was fascinated with the classic Universal and Hammer horror movies, most notably Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee's takes on Dracula. But that was nothing compared with my genuine obsession with Barnabas Collins, the vampire star of television's only gothic horror daily soap opera, Dark Shadows. From the moment I encountered that character one afternoon after school, he'd never fully gone away, a memory solidified by the fact that there was a period in the 1980s when I was hanging out with the man who played him, the late Jonathan Frid. Strangely, the idea of slayers, those whose chosen path was to take down my beloved vampires, among other supernatural threats, was appealing to me as well. I don't even want to get into the psychology of wanting to see the thing I love destroyed. The first person I recall doing that slaying was the reporter Carl Kolchak, played by Darren McGavin in the 1972 TV movie The Night Stalker, in which he discovered and took down a vamp haunting Las Vegas. A year later, Kolchak returned in The Night Strangler, and a year after that, in the weekly series Kolchak, The Night Stalker. There was also Roy Thinnis in 1973's The Norliss Tapes TV movie, Gene Roddenberry's 1977 TV movie Spectre, 1984's Ghostbusters, the following year's Fright Night, which introduced audiences to Roddy McDowall's Peter Vincent, and 1993's The X-Files, of course. But then there was Buffy the Vampire Slayer, debuting in 1997, which was an entity all its own, capturing the imagination with horror, humor, and, shockingly, three-dimensional characters as it introduced the world, and me, to Sarah Michelle Gellar's Buffy Summers, and the rest of her particular Scooby gang. And in that mix came the vampire with a soul, Angel, as played by David Boreanaz. One TV show with a vampire and a slayer? My mind was boggled, and since I had been a journalist for a great metropolitan newspaper — sorry, that was Clark Kent — that is, for a number of magazines, I was given an inside look at the making of the series and also of the spin-off Angel. But even before there was a Buffy TV show, there was Joss Whedon. Back in 1995, I was an editor at Cinescape magazine, and it was announced that a fourth movie in the Alien franchise, ultimately called Alien Resurrection, was going to be made. Really big news at the time, and that someone named Joss Whedon would be writing it. Well, back then, before every bit of information about a film fell under the full and complete control of studio publicists or the talent involved, was terrified of speaking out of turn, I figured there couldn't be too many people named Joss Whedon out there, so I called 411, information. A moment later, I had a phone number and decided to give it a call. Joss answered, I introduced myself, and we stayed on the phone for about an hour or so, engaging in what would be the first of many hours of conversation over the years. Eventually, when Buffy did become a TV series, Joss continued to make himself available to me, and he even made it possible for me to speak to many of the other writer-producers of both series. As a result, next to Star Trek, I don't think there were any other TV shows that I covered as much as I did Buffy and Angel. This book, then, is the culmination of my lifelong obsession with both vampires and slayers. In telling the story of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, particularly in the oral history format. It was our hope that this would be the most in-depth and intimate look at two shows that, whether people realized it or not, evolved the medium. A lot. December 31st, 2016. Part 1. Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She saved the world. A lot. Blonde on blonde. If I had the Slayer's power, I'd be punning right about now. The year was 1997, and a new series debuted on the WB network with the unlikely and unpromising title, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Based on the critically reviled 1992 film of the same name, few would have anticipated that the series would soon become one of the most beloved television series of all time, and pave the way for a succession of empowered female protagonists on television, including Sydney Bristow on Alias, the titular Veronica Mars, Battlestar Galactica's cigar-chomping Cara Thrace, and later Gwendolyn Christie's noble Brienne of Tarth on Game of Thrones, not to mention The Walking Dead's badass katana-wielding Michonne, among others. In the wake of the jingoistic, testosterone-fueled action fantasies of the 80s, with Sylvester Stallone refighting and winning the Vietnam War in Rambo, and Arnold Schwarzenegger mowing down hundreds, if not thousands, of adversaries, female heroes were few and far between. It's ironic, given the dominance of such smart-mouthed and capable women, like Carole Lombard, Jean Harlow, Myrna Loy, Katharine Hepburn, and Greta Garbo, in the screwball comedies of the 1930s, like It Happened One Night, The Thin Man, Bringing Up Baby, and Ninotchka, which paved the way for the powerful Barbara Stanwyck and Lana Turner in noirs of the 40s, like Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice. But women had rarely been considered action heroines. More often, they were the damsel in distress, or, more likely, the scantily clad love interest for Schwarzenegger, Stallone, and Norris, who seemed more interested in stroking their weapons than their women. But that was all about to change. Ridley Scott introduced a new kind of female protagonist in 1979's Alien, with Sigourney Weaver's smart, savvy, and sexy Ripley, and James Cameron took her matriarchal and xenomorph-slaying power to a whole new level in Aliens a few years later. By 1993, there was Johnny To's The Heroic Trio, a kick-ass Hong Kong chop-socky, in which a trio of female superheroes defeats an evil master who is raising kidnapped children into a super army. Sound vaguely familiar? But it was in the year 1997 that a new and thoroughly unexpected female superhero debuted on television, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. As in the great Stan Lee comics of the 1960s, this was a superhero who knew that with great power comes great responsibility, even if Buffy was more X-Men's Kitty Pryde than Spider-Man's Peter Parker, and who also found that her everyday problems as a student at Sunnydale High School often far exceeded the challenges created by her birthright as a vampire slayer. It is a show that changed the small screen forever, and, while it'd be hard to consider television an auteurist medium, Buffy is one of the few shows whose success and tone can be almost entirely credited to one man, Joss Whedon, the visionary writer, director, producer who brought the Slayer to life, death, and life again. Joss Whedon, creator, executive producer, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Buffy came from watching a horror movie and seeing the typical ditzy blonde walk into a dark alley and getting killed. I just thought that I would love to see a scene where the ditzy blonde walks into a dark alley, a monster attacks her, and she kicks its ass. So the concept was real simple. After all those times of seeing the poor girl who had sex and got killed, I just wanted to give her the power back.
Sarah Michelle Gellar, actress, Buffy Summers. For a long time, I think there was a lack of strong female characters on television, especially for young people, and it's so hard because that's the age you really want to identify with someone. You want to have a hero. And the thing I liked about Buffy and Willow, as well as Cordelia, is that they are okay with who they are. They're not the most popular or the most beautiful at school. Willow is the smartest, but they're okay with who they are, and there's a comfort in their individuality. Sarah Lemmelman. Author, It's About Power. Buffy the Vampire Slayer's stab at establishing the strength of girls on American television. Buffy the Vampire Slayer was revolutionary for its time as it created fresh images of females and demonstrated this to an important demographic: young teenage girls who are fed all sorts of conflicting and dispiriting representations of women. The show established that girls no longer had to adhere to the standards for females in society. Buffy showed that it was not acceptable for girls and women alike to degrade themselves in order to fit into society, as society should accept all versions of females: ladylike or virile, timid or outgoing, polite or crass, and even heterosexual or homosexual, among many other conflicting personalities and characteristics for women and girls.
Anthony C. Ferrante, director, Sharknado. Whereas in most horror movies the female lead became a survivor, Buffy's female lead became a hero. She didn't need to become ripped like Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2 or Sigourney Weaver in Aliens. She was able to be feminine and tough at the same time. The magic of Buffy is that you could relate to her. She still had insecurities, needs, and desires, but at her core, she also had to be a hero and a fighter to save herself and the ones she loved.
Sarah Lemmelman. The world of Buffy the Vampire Slayer was a refreshing escape for the female sex. Women were seen enacting change on their own accord and were equalized to, if not stronger than, men. Buffy asserted that women could, in fact, be valued in society. Unlike its predecessors in Wonder Woman and the Bionic Woman, Buffy the Vampire Slayer showed that young teenage girls could be powerful too. The members of its cast became role models for girls to escape demeaning female stereotypes that had been laid down for so long, and instead showed girls that it was perfectly acceptable to define themselves.
Anthony C. Ferrante. Ripley, in Alien, started out a lot like Buffy. She was the every person on that ship, the unlikely survivor and hero. She learned to become a badass and a hero while not sacrificing being herself in the process. Could Buffy have existed without Ripley in Alien? Probably. But Whedon has great taste, and again, understood what he appreciated about great horror movies of the 1970s and 1980s and did his spin on it, taking the best qualities from the best movies and making it into its own.
Sarah Lemmelman. Before Alien, movies that showed female empowerment focused on sex appeal. Charlie's Angels, Wonder Woman, which is not the case in Alien. Obviously, Buffy focuses on the title character's sex appeal, but the point of that is to undermine stereotypes. You can be beautiful and not in need of saving. Sigourney Weaver is this tireless fighter, which is something that is seen in Buffy.
Anthony C. Ferrante. Buffy really paved the way for more empowered female characters in the genre. Slasher films always had the strong female lead who was the final girl, but in some ways it was the process of elimination that made them the final survivor. In Buffy, it was less about a survivor and more about becoming a hero. In many vampire movies, women were under the thrall of a vampire and the victim in many instances, who needed to be saved by a Van Helsing-like character. Buffy, on the other hand, looked like the victim, but was Van Helsing instead, but with a healthy sense of fashion and pop culture smarts.
Charisma Carpenter. Actress, Cordelia Chase. She was just a normal kid, and she just wants to be a girl. My worldview at that age is not the same as it is now. I was 24 at the time. We weren't going through what we're going through right now. There wasn't an internet. There wasn't empowerment. There wasn't a female presidential candidate. I don't think woman power came into my consciousness until Buffy. I guess when you feel empowered in general, you aren't really propagating it because you don't really need to.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?